Whether you love them or hate them, conspiracy theories hold a very special place in our world.
I also talked to Jeffrey Epstein's brother, who gave me exclusive insight and tells me that he thinks the evidence shows that Jeffrey did not kill himself.
Birds aren't real. That rallying cry has taken wing among younger Americans. Thousands of Gen Zers across the country claim to believe the U.S. government, yes, Uncle Sam, has replaced all birds with look-alike drones being used to spy on the American people.
And the Earth is...
Flat.
The Earth is flat.
My reality, my senses tell me that the Earth is flat and stationary.
They are so prevalent, in fact, that the term itself, conspiracy theory, is also the subject of its very own conspiracy theory involving the CIA and other government forces hell-bent on discrediting the free thinkers of the world. I'm kidding, but not about the CIA. There really is a conspiracy theory about the word conspiracy theory, but is that really surprising? The term itself is often applied to real-world events where a supposed group of people, usually political in nature, have come together behind the scenes to cause, I don't know, death, mayhem, chaos for the people around them in all manner of ways and with no clear motive. These theories can be fun to entertain for a little while. And I stress entertain. So long as you're able to remain objective and separate the fact from the fabrication, they can be amusing, and sometimes they can teach you something you didn't know about our history, which is kind of exactly what I aim to do today. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s is to date one of the largest and most widespread conspiracy theories to have existed, and in many ways, it still persists today, although the subject matter and terminology have changed a bit since its inception. This event is responsible for some of the largest trials to ever take place in the United States, as well as the destruction of the lives of many innocent people, and it all started with a book. The 1970s saw the rise of a cultural phenomenon in America that had never really been seen before. Between the tragedy of the Jonestown Massacre, the Son of Sam killings, and the brutality inflicted upon the world by the members of the Manson family, it's really no wonder that people were rightly afraid and ready to fight anything that they felt was a danger to the youth of our nation. So in 1980, when Canadian psychologist Lawrence Pastor published the autobiographical novel Michelle Remembers, people were ready and willing to believe the harrowing story told within its pages. Michelle Smith was a woman who was seeing Dr. Pastor for depression and some issues that she was having within her marriage. During their sessions, they would use a type of therapy called recovered memory therapy to help her remember possible instances of abuse from her past that could be potentially causing her issues today. During these sessions, she detailed the ritual satanic abuse she supposedly suffered at the hands of her mother and various other cult members in the early to mid-1950s. Michelle and her doctor began consulting with various church authorities about the matter, and eventually they even traveled to the Vatican at one point, lending at least a little bit of credit to their story. The story Michelle Remembers was first published in articles for People magazine, and Pastor, along with his patient, toured the United States to promote the book. Together, the pair was able to secure a $100,000 payment for the rights to the hardcover, another $242,000 for the paperback edition, as well as royalty payments, and they even talked about a potential movie deal. Like, that's a lot. That's a pretty good chunk of change, honestly. Then in 1989, Oprah even featured the two on her show nearly 10 years after the initial publication, and they were seated with another woman whose name was Laurel Rose Wilson. She wrote the book Satanic Ritual Abuse Survivor Memoir, Satan's Underground, which is not really a catchy title, to be honest, but the book has been discredited and classified as a complete fabrication. A bit of a side note, Laurel Wilson, after her real name was discovered and her family background investigated, it turned out that she had a history of mental health issues and had been caught lying from making all kinds of wild claims about herself from a very early age. Like, looking into it a little bit, she actually had a perfectly middle-class upbringing with a perfectly normal family, and anyway, after she was found out, she changed her name to Laura Grabowski and pretended to be a Holocaust survivor, and even collected thousands of dollars that were supposed to go to foundations for actual Holocaust survivors and didn't. So that was the caliber of person that this was, and in making that connection, you probably already guessed where I'm going with this. Oprah reported these women's stories as 100% fact and never questioned the validity of their claims. But it's not really her fault because, well, no one else did either. The reality of the situation came to light in a Maclean's magazine article published on October 27, 1980, where investigative journalist Paul Gresko had interviewed the people closest to Michelle Smith and discovered a lot of discrepancies in her story. For one, the book failed to make any mention of Michelle's two sisters, and there was no mention of the fact that both Michelle and her doctor had divorced their partners and married each other, which is, well, it's illegal if he was still her therapist at the time, but it's also really, really fishy. No police reports were filed by Dr. Pazder, and he never made any attempts to involve the police or even verify any of the claims that Michelle had made during their sessions. And in the book, Michelle Remembers, she makes a few notable claims, like describing a car accident that she was involved in great detail, and she also made claims about a supposed 81-day non-stop satanic ritual that she was forced to participate in. There was no newspaper record of the car crash, despite the fact that the local paper reported on all car accidents at the time. Friends, neighbors, and former teachers were interviewed and yearbooks reviewed, and absolutely no evidence of Michelle being absent from school for any lengthy amount of time or her even being abused were ever found. You would think that if she was forced to participate in a black mass for 81 days, there would be some record of her disappearance. That's like over 2 months. Someone would have noticed something. In the end, investigators were unable to find anyone who knew Smith at the time that could corroborate any of the details of her story. Unfortunately, the information didn't get much attention from the public, and Michelle Remembers was still considered to be true by many. Dr. Pazder himself was considered to be an expert on the topic, and with the public in a full-on uproar and legal cases against supposed Satanists pouring in, his expertise was requested by many, and his book was often used as training material for those handling these cases. One of the most notable cases, and one that Dr. Pazder himself consulted on, was the McMartin preschool trial. In 1983, a woman by the name of Judy Johnson contacted police in Manhattan Beach, California to report that her young son was being abused by his daycare teacher and her estranged husband, a man named Ray Bucky. According to the reports, Judy was convinced that her son was being abused when he began complaining of having difficulties going to the bathroom. And the claims didn't stop at possible abuse. She also claimed that other daycare providers were getting frisky with animals that they brought in, and that Ray Bucky could fly. Yeah, no, she actually claimed that he could fly. It was very worth noting here that Judy Johnson was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had passed away from complications of chronic alcoholism before the preliminary hearing had even begun, so maybe not the most reliable of witness, but I digress. Ray Bucky was questioned and investigated, but he was never prosecuted due to a severe lack of evidence. However, the police sent out a letter to the parents of the McMartin students informing them that an abuse complaint had been filed and asked the parents to question their kids about Ray Bucky specifically. They even gave them specific details, like wanting to know if their kids had seen Ray with a child during nap time or if they'd ever seen him tie anyone up. Keep in mind that these children were mostly between the ages of 2.5 and 5, and for context, I once asked my 4-year-old, who was 3 at the time, so right in the middle there, if he had stolen the last piece of my donut, and he told me no directly to my face while shoving the last chunk of my donut into his mouth. So kids aren't exactly reliable. That's not to say we shouldn't believe children, but they lie about brushing their teeth and who threw what in the toilet this time. They don't usually lie about things like abuse. Unless they're being told what to lie about, which is kind of what happened in this case. Several hundred children were interviewed using techniques that essentially coached the kids on what to say and gave them ample opportunity to speculate or pretend about what may or may not have happened. Essentially, the confessions of abuse were led by the investigators themselves, and a lot of the kids just went along with it or added their own fantastical details when given the room to do so. Like, some of the claims involved an underground tunnel system that the kids were taken through to go see their abusers without being noticed by anyone. The grounds around the daycare center, however, were excavated, and no evidence of a tunnel system ever existing was found in that spot. They made claims that they saw Ray Bucky flying over the school and that they were flushed down the toilet where they would end up in a secret room to be abused. They claimed they saw adults participating in group activities at a car wash and were even taken on a hot air balloon to places like France, Canada, and Florida to meet with their abusers. It's again very worth noting that despite the kids making all of these claims about so many abusers, almost no one other than Ray Bucky was ever named, except for one kid who picked Chuck Norris out of a lineup as one of his abusers, so again, that kind of goes back to the kids aren't reliable thing. In the end, no evidence of wrongdoing was ever found, and Ray Bucky, as well as the staff of the McMartin school, namely his mother and sister, were acquitted of all charges after 7 years and $15 million spent, making it the longest and most expensive trial in United States history. What's worse is that a lot of information was withheld from the jury and even the defense, such as the original accuser's son not identifying Ray as his abuser, Judy's diagnosis as a schizophrenic, as well as her chronic dependence on the bottle, and the fact that Judy's son was reported to have denied that anything had happened. Despite this, though, Ray Bucky would ultimately spend 5 years in prison for a crime that he never committed. By the mid-1990s, the subject of Satanism and satanic abuse had started to kind of fade into the background. People began focusing on other things like where the Taco Bell Chihuahua came from, or whether or not Elvis was really alive in Costa Rica somewhere. But in 1993, in a small town in Arkansas, the fear of the devil was very much alive and about to claim its most devastating victims yet.
We, the jury, find Damien Eccles guilty of capital murder in the death of Chris Byers.
19-year-old Damien Eccles.
We, the jury, find
and his best friend, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, convicted.
It's wrong. All of it's wrong. It's been our Salem witch trial from the very beginning.
On May 5th, in 1993, 3 8-year-old boys were reported missing from their neighborhood in West Memphis, Arkansas. Stephen Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were all reported missing by Christopher's adoptive father, John Mark Byers, at around 7 p.m. that night after they had called the boys to come home, but they never returned. The search efforts on the first night were lacking at best, with only a handful of people haphazardly searching for the missing boys alongside law enforcement. A more thorough search would begin the next morning at around 8 a.m., and sometime between 1 and 2 p.m. that afternoon, an officer spotted a black shoe floating in a creek that led to a major drainage canal in the area known as Robin Hood Hills, a favorite hangout of the 3 boys. Not long after finding the shoe, the bodies of Stephen, Michael, and Christopher were discovered naked and hogtied with their own shoelaces in the bed of a muddy creek. The boys' bodies were in a horrible state, with cuts, lacerations, and signs of mutilation at first glance. I won't go into any more detail as it really is gruesome, but I will say that it didn't take much for the locals to begin assuming that something truly evil was going on in their town. Now, West Memphis, Arkansas is located in a strip of the United States known as the Bible Belt. Quick disclaimer, this is not in any way a jab at Christianity, but more so the mindset of some of those types of people in the southern United States. And look, before you come at me, okay, I was born in Missouri and I lived in Kentucky for 10 years, so I am not at all stereotyping when I say that the southern population, some of them down there, are scared of their own shadow and will gladly shoot first and ask questions later. I mean, they can be some of the most helpful and the nicest folks you will ever want to meet, but the smaller the town and the more God-fearing the population, the more likely you're to hear that anyone that doesn't look, think, talk, or act like everyone else in that town is either an addict of some kind, a Satanist, or someone that obviously has some awful secret that is totally different depending on who you ask. And yes, they do claim people are Satanists still. I was in fact my neighborhood Satanist. West Memphis is exactly that kind of town, and there were 3 teenage boys who didn't fit into the neighborhood model. Damian Eccles, 18 years old, Jesse Miss Kelly, 17 years old, and Jason Baldwin at 16. Jason and Damian were friends and had been arrested previously for petty things like vandalism, but what people in the town noted about them was the fact that Damian was an avid believer in Wicca and other forms of witchcraft. He dressed in all black, and he and Jason Baldwin would regularly smoke the devil's lettuce and listen to heavy metal music, sometimes even in cemeteries. Ooh. So they were pretty much just regular teenagers. We all got up to that. Anyway, Jesse Miss Kelly was a boy that they both attended school with, and while Damian and Jesse both dropped out of high school, they didn't know each other outside of their classes. Damian did spend a few months in a psychiatric unit when he was younger, and he was released with a diagnosis of basically paranoid schizophrenia, which, again, another thing I wanted to point out about the southern United States. In that area, healthcare is very lacking, especially mental health care. So you really only get diagnosed with one of 2 things, and that's either bipolar disorder or paranoid schizophrenia. So whether or not Damian Eccles actually has this disorder can be fairly up for debate. I've also noticed the subject of paranoid schizophrenia coming up a lot in this video, so let this be an example of how people with severe mental illnesses are likely to be heavily stigmatized for something that they really can't control. Be kind, people. It's really not that hard. Anyway, it didn't take long before the boys were singled out and called in for questioning, which is where the first set of problems comes in. The investigating officers admitted that when they began looking into this case, they felt that it had strong cult undertones. And both of them felt that Damian would be a likely suspect, based only on the fact that he had an interest in the occult and that one of the officers strongly believed that Eccles was capable of this kind of crime. So basically, he just looked like the kind of person who would do something like this. That's a really great start. Awesome. Damian was pulled in for questioning on May 7th, 2 days after the bodies had been found, and while he was never officially named as a suspect, police began interrogating him to, an insane degree. This went on for a month. They followed this poor kid around just because he looked shifty or something. On June 3rd, they finally switched their attention over to Jesse Miss Kelly and brought him in for questioning. Now, Jesse has a registered IQ of 72, which made him borderline intellectually functioning, and he was also a minor at the time of his interrogation. But the officers in charge interviewed him alone, and while his father did give him permission to go with the police, he did not, however, give them permission to interview or interrogate his son. So the 17-year-old low-functioning child was interrogated alone in a room for 12 hours without his parents present. And despite being read his Miranda rights, he didn't fully understand them. Only 46 minutes of the 12-hour interrogation were recorded, and Jesse confessed to the murder, implicating Damian and Jason as well. But he would later recant his statement, saying that he didn't understand what was happening and that he was coerced through threats, that if he didn't go along with the officers, they would punish him in some way or another. The details of Miss Kelly's various confessions changed as well. He didn't always line up with the evidence, such as mixing up the types of restraints used or claiming to see a sexual assault that had no medical evidence to back up such a claim. While the boys were on trial, many experts came forward in defense of the trio, stating that the so-called confessions were coerced and that Miss Kelly's statement should be disregarded in its entirety based on his level of mental retardation and lack of parental supervision. The evidence presented was lacking at best, and the investigation had been mishandled from the start, with the officers initially failing to properly secure the scene and disrupting what little evidence they did have. Their arguments, however, fell on deaf ears because on February 5th in 1994, Jesse Miss Kelly would be found guilty of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life plus 40 years. And just 1 month later, on March 19th, Damian Eccles and Jason Baldwin were sentenced as well. Jason to life in prison, and Damian Eccles was sentenced to death.
The first verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find Damian Eccles guilty of capital murder in the death of Stevie Brandt.
After the sentencing, the public who did know about this were completely outraged. And multiple documentary movies were made pointing out the horrifying errors made by the investigating officers. From failing to notify the coroner for 2 hours after the bodies were discovered, to removing them from the water and exposing them to sunlight, insects, and the elements before the coroner even arrived to determine the exact cause or time of death. The creek bed that the boys were found in had been trampled, and the creek itself had not been properly drained to allow forensic teams to preserve any trace evidence that might have been left behind. Samples were not properly tested, if they were tested at all, and blood from the scene was never tested, which is one of the major things in a crime scene I would think you would want to test. I don't know, I'm not a CSI, but it makes no sense to find blood at a murder scene and not at least think to test to see if it was even the victim's blood. But I think the most damning confession of all was the admission from a juvenile probation officer who was assisting at the scene, who heard one of the investigative officers say, "It looks like Damien Echols finally killed someone." The decision was already made, as soon as the bodies were found, that these kids didn't fit in, and especially this one didn't, so they had their bad guy already, and all they needed was a way to make it fit neatly together. In 2007, after multiple attempts at an appeal, some new information came to light. An original informant by the name of Vicky Hutchinson, whose very young son claimed to have seen, quote, Satanists speaking Spanish near the creek bed, recanted her statement and claimed that she only gave it because the police had threatened to take her son away from her if she didn't. And seeing as how that was a real possibility in her case, having been fighting criminal charges at the time, she did what she was told. In 2007, DNA from the original crime scene was tested, and it was determined not to be a match to either Damien, Jesse, or Jason. And a hair that was reported to belong to a man named Terry Hobbs, Stephen Branch's stepfather, was found tied into one of the knots used to restrain the victims. Additionally, after the murders, family members found a knife belonging to Stephen, one that he was rarely ever without, in Terry's nightstand, with no explanation to be had. A woman named Jo Lynn had also stated that she had seen Terry washing clothes, bed linens, and curtains from Stephen's room at an odd time around the time of the murders. Written statements were also presented from two men, claiming to have had information on the case linking Terry Hobbs to the murders, but they were ignored by police in the initial investigation. At this point, the family of the murdered boys had joined in on the defense, and after weeks of negotiation on August 19, 2011, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miss Kelly were released from prison after entering into what's known as an Alford plea. The Alford plea is a legal move that gives you the right to plead guilty while asserting your innocence. Basically, it's when you know and the court knows that you didn't do it, but you know that they know that you know that if they really wanted to, they could keep you in prison because reasons. None of them legit, I'm sure. The three men were sentenced to time served and had spent over 18 years in prison for a crime that they did not commit. Jason Baldwin was originally reluctant to sign the plea deal, stating that he didn't feel right pleading guilty to something that he didn't do. But they were trying to kill Damien, and that just wasn't justice. All three of them have since gone on to lead quiet lives, far away from a town that locked them away for committing a crime of being different. Jason Baldwin is concentrating on living a normal, low-key life and has enrolled in college with the hopes of being a lawyer to help other wrongfully convicted persons overturn their rulings. Damien has relocated with his wife, who he married while serving his time on death row. He writes books and even has his own YouTube channel where he shares his love of the occult, and I will link that in the description below for anyone who is interested in seeing that. Jesse Miss Kelly is reported to be engaged to his high school girlfriend, and at one point had enrolled in community college to become an auto mechanic. I love happy endings. I really do. It would have been much better if they hadn't spent 2 decades in prison for a crime they didn't commit, and it would have been even better if that time had been spent on identifying the real killer, but I guess you can't turn back time, and you can't undo what's been done, no matter how much you may want to. The Satanic Panic started with a book. A looming and unseen threat, and a strong desire to protect those closest to us. Just like every witch hunt in history, it ends in false accusations and destroyed lives. The people of Manhattan Beach, California only wanted to protect their children from the horrors of abuse, and that gave the people of West Memphis, Arkansas the fuel that they needed to finally take down those who didn't belong. Those they deemed different. Those they deemed evil. Even satanic. Conspiracy theories can be entertaining if handled responsibly, but this should definitely serve as an example and a warning of what can happen when rumors are not kept in check and people become so terrified of the world around them, they're willing to turn on the people closest to them without a moment's hesitation. That's all for this episode of After Dark, the first in a new series where we discuss the side of our world that only seems to exist after the sun goes down. If you like this episode, don't forget to leave me a like and maybe subscribe. I super appreciate it. Your likes and everything make my whole day, and I can't thank you guys enough for taking time out of your day to hang out with me. Until next time, sweet dreams.